Grace and peace, Shepherd family. It's Pastor Leon, and as you may have noticed, I am not there today, in person anyway. I am online watching just like the rest of you, but I'm not there in person this morning, and that's because our middle son, Jackson, our 16-year-old, tested positive for COVID. He is all good. Everything is fine. He's just quarantined off to one section of the house. The rest of the family all tested negative. And so we're quarantining too, although we may not be quarantining quite as long. And we'll be taking some additional tests in the coming week. But out of an abundance of caution, I am not at the church today, obviously. And so I'm going to be preaching to you from my office. It's not my preference. This is a particular sermon that I wanted to do in front of the camera. I wanted to do it in the sanctuary. I was excited about that, but this is the world we live in, and this is the punches that we have to roll with. So that's what we're going to do today. It is a season of unexpectedness, after all. This is the season of Epiphany, and we have been working through a sermon series that we have entitled Expect the Unexpected. And we are journeying through the season of Epiphany. When we begin to see more clearly, if we have eyes to see, we can begin to see more clearly who Jesus is and what Jesus came to do. And there are gifts that Epiphany gives to us, and we've been talking about those over the course of the last several weeks. But one of the gifts that Epiphany gives to us is the gift of common ground. The gift of common ground. Now you might say, Leon, well, how does that work? What do you mean the gift of common ground? Well, because God became one of us, because of the incarnation, that doctrine that you hear talked about sometimes in churchy world, the incarnation where God became one of us in order to rescue all of us. That in Jesus, God took on human form to more fully sort of be in empathy and connectedness with us. And because of that incarnation, there's common ground that exists between all of us. And it's difficult sometimes to find that common ground, isn't it? Especially in times of great division. And right now, you and I are experiencing some incredible divisions within our culture. We see that all around us. That people seem to be, in some cases, hopelessly divided. And so what do we do when the divisions between us are too great? What do we do when it feels like there's no way that I could bridge the gap between what I think and what I believe and what that person thinks and believes? And here's something that's even more challenging. What happens to us? What do we do when even friends and loved ones disappoint us with the way that they believe certain things or the opinions that they have, or through their particular political or social worldview, or the things that they post on social media? That in and of itself is one of the most disappointing things that I've experienced over the course of the last several months. I mean, even all the way back into the summer, having friends and family members say things that just are so contrary to what I think and I feel. And it just wounds your heart, doesn't it? I mean, it makes you feel like, do I even really know that person? I mean, they just seem to be disappointing us. And, here's the other side of it, that sometimes when you and I post or we talk about or we share our opinions, our things that we feel deeply and strongly about, that there are probably friends and family members who might feel the same way. They're like, how in the world could they believe that or think that, right? And so this great gulf has been created between so many of us, in large part because of the way that we are able to share so many of our opinions and so many of our ideas. And so what we need to do, and this is what we're going to be focused on today, we're going to be focused on what it means to look for something to unite us, to find some common ground. And since it is the season of Epiphany, sometimes common ground can come from the most surprising things of all, like Bernie Sanders and his mittens. Some of y'all were thinking, I wonder if Pastor Leon is ever going to talk about Bernie Sanders and his mittens. Bernie Sanders and the photos that were taken, the photo that was taken at the inauguration of Bernie Sanders when he was sitting by himself at the inauguration with his mittens and his dumpy looking jacket on. And so you've got this image of Bernie Sanders, just sitting by himself. He looks like a grumpy old dude, right? But he was just wanting to be warm. I mean, he was being practical. But this was turned into a meme. Now, when we say meme, what we mean practically within our current culture is that it's something that's duplicated, replicated, and it takes on meaning within our culture. And so Bernie Sanders has been placed in all kinds of unusual positions and situations. This little photo of him has been found everywhere. For example, it's found in historical settings, as you can see, where Washington and Bernie are crossing the Delaware. And then this is one of my personal favorites, where Bernie shows up actually at the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. I just love that one. This is also one of my favorites. It's a bit obscure, but here you see this is the Sistine Chapel ceiling where God is reaching out to touch the finger of Adam, and instead it's mittens. That's so amazing. Bernie crossed over into pop culture as well. Of course, here's Bernie riding in the vehicle of the Beverly Hillbillies. This is an obscure one that I was so excited about. This is the photograph from Back to the Future that Michael J. Fox's character had on him, right? And as the future began to change, his family started to fade. And someone put Bernie in the midst of that. That's so great. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. All right, then there's this one. If you're a fan of the Big Bang Theory, Leonard, he's in my spot. And then, of course, this is one of my favorites because it's one of my favorite movies, The Big Lebowski, and Bernie is there with his mittens really pulling the room together. Of course, then Bernie has also appeared on record albums, on album covers. This is him on Beastie Boys, Check Your Head. This one was one of my favorites from Metallica, Ride the Lightning. There's Bernie there. Or Fleetwood Mac, Rumors is always a good one. And then Bernie showed up putting a guy into a submission hold as an MMA fighter. That one was fantastic. Or here's our last one. And this is Bernie selling Girl Scout cookies. So what is it about this particular meme? Like, what is it about this that softened things ever so slightly? Because there were people all over my social media pages, people who were different in terms of their political leanings, people who had maybe even been arguing a bit online about the way that they felt about the election or the insurrection at the Capitol building or all of the other things that have happened over the past several months. And yet they all seem to find common ground by posting photos of Bernie doing incredibly awesome stuff. So what is it about this that softened things ever so slightly? Well, it has to do with something really, really fundamental. The spaces where Bernie found himself were common spaces. They were common ground spaces, right? Because there are both Republicans and Democrats who love the Beastie Boys. There are people from diametrically opposed viewpoints, whether it is faith or politics or whatever, that all just adore the idea of Bernie selling Girl Scout cookies, or Bernie putting someone into a submission hold, or Bernie crossing the Delaware with George Washington. There's all of these sort of common ground spaces. Like, how can you hate somebody who you know loves Metallica? Am I right? I mean, like, you could be like, I disagree with you, but you love Metallica, so there you go. I mean, do you know what I'm saying? It's like a common ground space. Like, this little meme demonstrated to us in just a small way the possibilities that exist when we are able to find common ground. And so today, the sermon is going to take an interesting direction We're going to learn about why eating idol-sacrificed meat is a metaphor for our current context. And we're going to take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 13, where the Apostle Paul was talking to the church at Corinth about the dispute over meat that was sacrificed to idols. And so we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But here's what I want us to hold on to. The one thing that's going to weave its way through this entire sermon. And that's this. You have to move to find common ground. You have to move to find common ground. There's going to be more to come in just a little while. Don't go away. I'll still be here in my office waiting for you when you get back. But we're going to have more in just a little while. Stay tuned. So, as I said, we're going to be talking about how the Apostle Paul addressed an issue at the church in Corinth. Right? So Corinth was a Greek-influenced city that the Apostle Paul had planted a church in. It was a cosmopolitan city. It was like twice the size, maybe 3 times the size of the city of Athens. So it was super important. But the Apostle Paul wrote to them a letter where he was talking to them about the issues that they were struggling with as a church. And there was a group of people in the church at Corinth that were at odds with each other over meat sacrificed to idols. And so let's read what the Apostle Paul had to say about all of this. Now, about food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all possess knowledge. But knowledge puffs up, while love builds up. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. But whoever loves God is known by God. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came and for whom we live, and there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. But not everyone possesses this knowledge. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat sacrificial food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to a god. And since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. But food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. Be careful there, however, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone with a weak conscience sees you with all your knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't that person be emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother or sister for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. When you sin against them in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again so that I will not cause them to fall. Now, I just want to share just a bit of the context within which the Apostle Paul is writing. So this is, as I said, the city of Corinth. It's a Greek-influenced city. It was a cosmopolitan city. There were people from all over the world that would come to this city for tourism and also for worship. There was a huge temple to Aphrodite. There was a temple to Poseidon. There were temples to Apollo and to all kinds of other gods in the Greek pantheon. Now, this huge temple to Aphrodite also brought with it a lot of other things as well. Temple prostitution, some debauchery, but it was a big business first and foremost, right? And so here's something that would happen with these huge temples, because people would come around from all over the world. They would come to these temples and would bring sacrifices. So they would bring, sheep, goats, lambs, all kinds of birds and so forth. So they would bring these animals to the temple to be sacrificed. Well, the priests in all of these different temples, including the temple at Jerusalem, the temple to the one God, Herod's temple, in first century Jerusalem, Even in that temple, when people would bring animals to be sacrificed, they wouldn't sacrifice the entire animal. They would just sacrifice parts of it. And so it was customary for the priests to keep most of the animal, really, and so then they would resell that. So priests in those days, whether it was at the temple to Aphrodite or the temple to Poseidon or whoever else, they were like butchers more than they were priests, because that was the nature of their business, to be able to butcher the animals in such a way and to carve up the meat in such a way that they would sacrifice what was necessary and sell the rest. And so lots of people in the first century throughout the Roman Empire would purchase their meat from the temples, right? From the various temples where they would have all of this excess meat. And the same thing was true in the temple in Jerusalem. They kept a lot of that meat and then would indeed sell it as well. And so there were people within the church at Corinth that were offended. They were offended by their fellow Christians who would buy and eat meat that was part of that temple process, part of the sacrifice of idols, right? To sacrifice to idols. And so they were saying that is not right. You're not a real Christian, essentially, if you do that. And so these other people were like, what? Are you kidding me? We're just eating meat. It's just meat. And so the Apostle Paul weighs in on this. His argument is interesting because he starts off by basically saying, idols are not real. These are not real. Okay? And even if some people think they're real, they're still not real. So this is for you to be offended because somebody is buying meat that was sacrificed to something that isn't real. That's kind of splitting hairs there, my friend. He's like going, look, you've got this knowledge, right? There's an important aspect of being a follower of Christ is a knowledge of who Christ is. A knowledge of what it means to follow the one God and to say that Jesus is Lord. And so he starts off by saying that, right? That idol worship is meaningless and meat is meat. But there's a key phrase in there that he uses that I think is so important. He says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. This is sort of the keystone to his entire argument. Because what he then goes on to say is, look, having said all that, if it offends my brother or sister who is weaker and doesn't have that knowledge or hasn't fully gotten their minds around this, that's okay. I don't want to cause them to stumble. And so you know what? If it means giving up meat altogether, I'd be willing to do that. Now, granted, the Apostle Paul is speaking in hyperbole, but he's making his point because he takes both sides of the argument. This is not about being right. It's about finding common ground. It's about meeting one another where we happen to be. And he also wants to say that this is not a hill to die on, people. I'm serious. Seriously, this is the thing that you're going to debate about. This is the thing that's going to divide you. And so in the end, the question that he wanted the Corinthians to ask was, are we majoring on the minors, but minoring on the majors? Are we not giving enough attention to the things that really and truly draw us together, which is Christ himself and what Christ did for us and for all of creation? That's the thing that's most important. Jesus, saying Jesus is Lord. And if that's what we're focused on, that's the major thing that we need to be drawing out as common ground. The other stuff, all these other things are non-essential. And so what the Apostle Paul wanted these followers to realize was this: if at all possible on non-essentials, if you have to choose between being loving and being right, be loving. And so what do we do as followers of Christ who are called to be peacemakers, who are called to try to figure out how to live with one another? Well, the lesson that the Apostle Paul gives us here is so instructive that we've got to figure out, what are the non-essential things that we seem to be making essential? What are the things that we are dividing ourselves as believers over that really and truly the Apostle Paul would say, guys, come on, you've got to move toward each other. You've got to figure out what the common ground here is and focus on that. And so that's what I want to spend the next few minutes talking about as it relates to us as Shepherd of the Hills Presbyterian Church. Because when we say that we love God and love everybody, do we really mean it? Do we really mean this? Is this something that we want to hold on to, that we want to lift up, that we want to make, truly like this is who we are? This is what Jesus taught us, right? Jesus taught us what it meant to love God and love everybody. He said that this was indeed the greatest commandment. The greatest commandment, he said, was a twofold commandment: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so for us to live into that, to love God and love everybody, not only do we have to show our love for God and really and truly, learn what that means, but we also need to show our love for others. And when we show our love for others, we inherently then are showing the world what it means to us to love God. But there's something else in the mix of that. And that is that little phrase, love your neighbor as yourself. What is it that we expect when it comes to our relationships, when it comes to our connections, when it comes to people even that we find disagreement with? What is it that we want? We want to be heard, right? We want to be respected. We want not to be shouted down. We want to be acknowledged. We want to be seen. And so these are all the things that you and I need to practice as well, even with people who we disagree with. Now, here's where it always starts to get sticky, because there are lots of people who will say, well, Leon, are you serious? There are people over there saying the most egregious things. They stand for things that I absolutely cannot stand for. I have to speak out. That is a huge gap between us. How do I figure out common ground when I realize that this person, maybe a loved one, maybe a friend, a coworker, is so far away from me when it comes to this particular issue? Well, that is a big question for us as a church. Can we be faithful to our deepest convictions without othering one another? Without turning somebody else into the other, even if they disagree with us, even if they have a different opinion? And so here's practically what this means for you and I as a congregation. Because we want to have a bigger table. That has been the vision of loving God and loving everybody since we really and truly stepped into this several years ago. To love God and love everybody means that we set a big table, that there are more spaces. It's like when you take the extension of the table, because you know that there's going to be a bunch of people coming over. And at one point in time, your table only needed to be so big because there were only so many people. But you've got friends, you've got family, you've got other people that are coming to eat. And so you put the extension in and you make the table bigger. Just because you make the table bigger doesn't mean that there's no longer a place for the people who used to sit there. And that's what a lot of people think. A lot of people within the church, that's what they assume. They assume that when my church starts to talk about having a bigger table, that suddenly I don't have a place. That couldn't be further from the truth. You have a place. You always had a place. This is what Jesus was trying to teach his followers a little bit about when he told the story of the prodigal son and the brother that was upset because there was a bigger table that was set for a party, and he felt like he didn't have a place at the table. And the father in that story says, you have always been with me. You've always had a space. This has always been about you as well. Now we got to rejoice because there's more people at the table. That's what we need to focus on. And so if you're struggling sometimes when you think about the fact that, maybe our congregation looks out and says, we want to have a bigger table. We want more people to feel like they can sit with us. It doesn't mean that you don't have a space. You do. And we are so grateful that we have that big umbrella, that we are the kind of congregation that believes that when you love God and love everybody, it means everybody. Second, Speaking truth to power and speaking the truth in love are things that we must do in tandem, because we can't be afraid to speak truth to power. We can't be afraid to talk about injustice. We can't be afraid to say that there are things that go against what it means to follow Christ, based on Jesus' example, based on the things that Jesus said and taught. We can't be afraid to critique those that are in power if they are doing and saying things that run contradictory to what it means to follow Jesus. We cannot be afraid to do that. But we need to be able to do it in a way that it's done in love. And we also need to have some humility. Because as the Apostle Paul was trying to point out to those people in Corinth, is that you don't know everything. You don't know everything. And you need to realize that knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. We have an enormous capacity to fall into error. And so we need to be aware of that. We need to act in humility towards one another. And that means being able to say, but I could be wrong. Now, this doesn't mean that you sacrifice your values, that you throw aside the things that you know are just intrinsic to what it means to be a follower of Christ. That is not what I am asking anybody to do. In fact, what I am encouraging all of us to do is to draw closer to Christ, because it is Christ that is our common ground. It is Christ alone that is our common ground as followers of Jesus. In the end, if we have chosen to do what Jesus would have us to do, to live by his example, to live sacrificially, to reach out to those who are on the margins, to speak truth to the authorities, to speak truth to those who are overly religious, who have piled on rules and regulations, but also to make them know that there's a place for them at the table if they want to embrace a bigger table. I mean, all of these things are all part and parcel of what it means to be the kind of congregation that loves God and loves everybody. There is so much common ground between us. Christ is our common ground. But Christ plays in 10,000 places, as Eugene Peterson once wrote. There are so many ways that we can find connections with one another if we are willing to try. And that may mean that we're going to have to move from some of our intransigence and our places where we feel like we've got to dig in, that we might have to move just a bit, so that we can open up some space to find that common ground. Because in the end, brothers and sisters, you and I have to move to find common ground. May it be so for all of us during these challenging times, and may we be the kinds of people that find that common ground and stand on it with others. Hallelujah. Amen.